The compass spun wildly in Elena Vasquez's weathered hands, its needle dancing like a confused child in the pre-dawn darkness of the Afghan mountains. 3 trucks behind her carried 27 souls, aid workers, translators, and wounded civilians, all trusting their lives to a woman they dismissed as just the driver for the past 18 months. The metallic taste of fear coated her tongue as she stared through the cracked windshield at terrain that looked identical in every direction. Jagged rocks, scrub brush, and the kind of hostile emptiness that swallowed convoys whole. "The GPS died an hour ago," whispered Marcus Chen, the supply coordinator hunched in the passenger seat, his usually steady voice trembling like autumn leaves. "Radio's been dead since we left the compound. Elena, we're completely blind out here." His fingers drummed anxiously against his thigh, a nervous tic she'd noticed developing over the past month as their missions grew increasingly dangerous. Behind them, Dr. Sarah Okafor leaned forward from the cramped back seat, her medical bag clutched against her chest like a shield. The brilliant surgeon who'd saved countless lives in makeshift operating rooms now looked small and vulnerable in the growing darkness. "There are children in Truck 3, she said, her Nigerian accent thick with exhaustion. "2 of them are running fevers. We can't afford to get lost out here, Elena. We just can't." Elena's calloused hands tightened on the steering wheel, hands that had learned to navigate not just roads, but the treacherous landscape of being underestimated. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent her childhood summers with her grandmother in the New Mexico desert, learning to read the language written in starlight. Her abuela's voice echoed across the years. "Mija, the stars never lie. Men lie, governments lie, even compasses lie. But the stars, they've been telling the truth since before humans learned to speak." The convoy had fled the medical outpost just after midnight, when intelligence reports confirmed Taliban forces were closing in. Now, 6 hours later, they were deep in disputed territory with no clear path home. The official route back to Kabul had been compromised, forcing them into the labyrinth of unmarked mountain roads where GPS satellites couldn't penetrate the rocky overhangs, and electronic jamming equipment rendered their technology useless. "There," Elena said suddenly, pointing through the windshield at a gap between 2 towering peaks. "That's north, true north." She turned off the engine, ignoring Marcus's sharp intake of breath. In the sudden silence, the mountain wind whistled through bullet holes in the truck's side panels, souvenirs from their hasty escape. "How can you possibly know that?" Marcus demanded, his engineer's mind struggling to process navigation without instruments. "There's no sun, no landmarks, nothing but rocks and—" "Stars," Elena interrupted, already climbing out of the truck. The bitter mountain air hit her like a physical blow, carrying scents of snow and danger. She walked to the center of the small clearing where their convoy had stopped, tilting her head back to study the vast tapestry above. The others followed reluctantly, their breath creating small clouds in the thin air. Polaris hung steadfast in the northern sky, exactly where it had been every clear night of her childhood, when her grandmother would spread a blanket on the desert floor and teach her the ancient art of celestial navigation. "The North Star sits at the end of the Little Dipper's handle," Elena explained, her voice carrying a certainty that made the others lean closer. The doctor stared upward with the same intensity she brought to surgery. "But how do you know which star is which? They all look the same to me." Elena smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in weeks. "Look for the Big Dipper first. See those 7 bright stars forming a ladle? Follow the line from the 2 stars at the end of the Dipper's bowl, extend it about 5 times that distance, and you'll find Polaris." She traced the invisible line with her finger, and slowly the pattern became visible to the others. Marcus squinted upward, his skepticism warring with desperation. Even if you're right about north, how do we know which direction leads to safety? We could be walking straight into an ambush. Because I've been studying these mountains for 18 months while everyone else studied their GPS screens, Elena replied, her voice carrying steel beneath the softness. Every supply run, every medical evacuation, every time you all dismissed me as just the driver, I was memorizing. Ridgelines, water sources, seasonal animal paths. The Taliban use the main roads and valleys, but there's an old smuggler's route that follows the star path my grandmother taught me. It runs along the ridgelines, invisible from below. The weight of leadership settled on her shoulders like her grandmother's heavy winter shawl. These people who had treated her as invisible, who had made decisions around her rather than with her, who had never once asked her for her opinion in mission briefings, now hung on her every word. The irony wasn't lost on her, but survival had a way of stripping away everything except what truly mattered. The route will take us higher into the mountains, she continued, watching their faces carefully. It's longer, colder, and more dangerous, but it's also the last place they'll expect a medical convoy to go. Smugglers have used it for decades to avoid checkpoints and patrols. Dr. Okafor nodded slowly. What other choice do we have? The children won't survive if we're captured. Her words carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much suffering, who understood that sometimes the most dangerous path was the only one that led home. As they climbed back into the trucks, Elena caught her reflection in the side mirror. The same face that colleagues had looked through for months now carried an authority that surprised even her. Her dark eyes held secrets learned in desert nights and mountain passes, knowledge passed down through generations of women who'd navigated by stars when the world told them they couldn't navigate at all. The convoy began its ascent into the unknown, following a path lit only by ancient starlight and guided by a woman whose worth had finally been recognized when recognition meant the difference between life and death. Behind them, the compound they'd called home for over a year grew smaller, its lights eventually disappearing behind the mountain's bulk. But Elena didn't look back. Her eyes remained fixed on the stars above and the treacherous road ahead, where every mile would test not just her navigation skills, but her ability to transform from an overlooked driver into the leader these people desperately needed. The mountains held their breath, waiting to see if the woman they'd called just the driver could navigate more than roads, if she could navigate them all through the darkness and into dawn. Elena's journey to this moment hadn't begun in the mountains of Afghanistan, but in the sun-baked parking lots of Albuquerque, where at 16 she'd learned to drive her father's battered pickup truck while he lay dying of lung disease in the Veterans Hospital. Every evening after school, she'd practice three-point turns in parallel parking while her mother worked double shifts at the diner, both of them pretending they weren't terrified of the future rushing toward them like a freight train. Her grandmother, Elena Vasquez, had been her anchor during those turbulent years. Every weekend, Elena would drive the pickup 90 minutes into the desert, where her abuela maintained a small adobe house that had belonged to the family for 4 generations. Men think they invented navigation, Esperanza would say, her arthritic fingers pointing out constellations with the precision of a master craftsman. But women have been finding their way by stars since before maps existed. We guided our families across oceans, across deserts, across borders. The stars don't care about your gender, mija. They only care that you listen. Those desert lessons had shaped Elena more than any classroom education. While her classmates worried about prom dates and college applications, she learned to identify Cassiopeia's W shape in the northern sky, to track the seasonal movement of Orion across the celestial sphere, to use the Southern Cross during the brief months it appeared above the horizon. Her grandmother taught her that navigation was more than finding direction. It was about understanding her place in an infinite universe. But the world had other ideas about Elena's place. After high school, she had enrolled in the University of New Mexico's engineering program, dreaming of designing bridges or spacecraft. The first semester crushed those dreams with the methodical precision of water wearing away stone. Professors who never learned her name despite her raising her hand in every class, study groups that somehow forgot to invite her, lab partners who assumed she'd take notes while they handled the real work. By sophomore year, Elena had switched to business administration, telling herself it was more practical anyway. By junior year, she was working full-time at a logistics company to help her mother pay for her father's mounting medical bills. The degree became secondary to survival, and survival meant accepting that the world saw her as someone who could get things done, quietly, efficiently, invisibly. The transition to military contracting had felt natural. Her logistics background, her security clearance from a brief stint with the Transportation Authority, and her willingness to go wherever the work took her. Afghanistan hadn't been a dream destination, but it paid 3 times what she could make in Albuquerque, and her mother needed the money for her own mounting health problems. For 18 months, Elena had driven through some of the most dangerous territory on Earth, ferrying supplies and personnel between forward operating bases and civilian aid stations. She dodged IEDs, navigated through sandstorms that turned day into night, and once spent 16 hours hiding in an abandoned village while insurgents searched for her convoy. Through it all, she'd been the driver, competent, reliable, forgettable. The aid workers treated her with the polite indifference reserved for service providers. They discussed mission parameters around her as if she were furniture. During briefings, they'd hand her an address or GPS coordinates and assume she'd figure out the rest. No one asked about her opinions on route security or her observations about changing patterns and rebel activity. She was there to drive, not to think. Dr. O'Coffer had been the exception, at least partially. The surgeon occasionally made conversation during long trips, sharing stories about her training in Lagos and her work with Doctors Without Borders in Somalia. But even Sarah's kindness carried an undercurrent of assumption. Elena was someone to be friendly with, not someone to rely on for anything beyond transportation. Marcus had been the worst, though Elena recognized his dismissiveness came from insecurity rather than malice. The young engineer had arrived 6 months ago, fresh from MIT, his head full of theoretical knowledge and his laptop bag full of cutting-edge gadgets. He'd immediately reorganized the supply chain with algorithms and efficiency matrices, never bothering to ask Elena about the practical realities of moving materials through war zones. When his optimized routes led to 3 near disasters in the first month, he'd blamed everything except his own inexperience. "Maybe if our driver was more familiar with the terrain," he'd said during one particularly tense briefing, his voice carrying that special condescension reserved for people who mistake credentials for competence. Elena had bitten back her response then, that she'd driven every road in their operational area multiple times, that she'd memorized not just routes, but seasonal flooding patterns, market days that caused traffic jams, and the subtle differences in checkpoint procedures that could save hours or cost lives. She'd learned to swallow such moments, filing them away like her grandmother filed recipes, carefully preserved but rarely shared. Each slight, each assumption, each time someone spoke about her in the third person while she sat 3 feet away, had become another star in her private constellation of resentment and determination. The irony was that Elena had fallen in love with Afghanistan despite everything. The country revealed its beauty slowly, like her grandmother's desert had, harsh and forbidding at first glance, but rich with subtle wonders for those patient enough to look closely. She'd learned to read the landscape's moods, to anticipate how weather patterns affected road conditions, to distinguish between the dust clouds raised by military convoys and those stirred up by civilian traffic. She'd also fallen in love with the night sky here, so much clearer than anything visible near Albuquerque's light pollution. During her off hours, Elena would climb to the compound's highest tower and spend hours reacquainting herself with constellations, sometimes calling her grandmother on the satellite phone to share observations about the moon's phases or the clarity of the Milky Way. These calls had become lifelines, connecting her to the woman who taught her that knowledge was power,
even when the world refused to recognize it. "Are you being careful, mija?" Esperanza would ask during their weekly conversations. "Not just with bombs and bullets, but with your heart. Don't let them make you small." The warning had proven prophetic. 18 months of being treated as invisible had started to make Elena feel actually invisible, as if her thoughts and observations mattered less because no one bothered to ask for them. She'd caught herself apologizing for speaking up in meetings, offering tentative suggestions instead of stating facts she knew with certainty. But tonight was different. Tonight, their survival depended entirely on knowledge the world had dismissed as unimportant, skills it had never bothered to acknowledge. As Elena navigated the treacherous mountain road by starlight, she felt something awakening that had been dormant.
For months, the fierce confidence her grandmother had nurtured, the certainty that came from understanding her place in the universe, not as someone small and forgettable, but as someone entrusted with ancient wisdom. The truck's engine strained against the steep grade, its headlights illuminating only a few yards of rocky path ahead. Behind them, the other vehicles followed in single file, their occupants trusting completely in Elena's ability to guide them through territory that existed on no official map. The responsibility should have been crushing, but instead it felt like coming home to herself. "How much further?" Dr. Okafor asked softly, noting the way Elena's knuckles had whitened on the steering wheel as they navigated around a particularly treacherous curve. 3 hours to the Ridgeline Pass," Elena replied without hesitation. "Maybe 4 if we encounter rockfalls. After that, it's downhill to the valley where we can pick up the secondary road to Kabul." She spoke with the calm certainty of someone reading familiar text, not the desperate hope of someone guessing at distances. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat. "How can you be so sure? This isn't exactly mapped territory." Elena glanced at him in the rearview mirror, seeing something she'd never noticed before, not skepticism, but genuine curiosity mixed with grudging respect. For the first time in 18 months, he was asking her opinion not as a courtesy, but because her answer might save his life. "Because I've been watching, learning, preparing for exactly this situation," she said simply. "While you've all been focused on your immediate jobs, I've been studying the bigger picture." Someone had to. The admission hung in the air like incense, sacred and slightly dangerous. Elena had never voiced her frustration so directly, had never allowed herself to acknowledge how thoroughly she'd been preparing for the moment when being just the driver wouldn't be enough. But here in the darkness, with death lurking in every shadow and safety existing only in the space between one careful decision and the next, honesty felt like the only luxury they could afford. The first sign of real trouble came 2 hours into their mountain ascent when Elena spotted the amber glow of fires in the valley below. Too many fires, too perfectly spaced to be anything but military encampments. She pulled the convoy to a stop beneath an overhang of rock that would hide them from thermal imaging and climbed out to study the pattern of lights with binoculars salvaged from the abandoned outpost. "Taliban forward positions," she murmured to Marcus and Dr. Okafor, who joined her outside the truck. "See how they're positioned at each valley mouth? They're running a sweep operation, pushing north toward the main highway. Anyone trying to escape through the valleys is going to hit a wall." Marcus peered through the binoculars, his engineering mind struggling to process tactical information. "But that means they know about the evacuation. This isn't exactly random patrol activity. They're specifically hunting for refugees and aid workers." Dr. Okafor's medical bag slipped from her shoulder, landing with a soft thud that somehow sounded like defeat. "The children, they're targeting civilians. This is a deliberate humanitarian crisis." Elena felt her grandmother's voice rising from memory. "When men make war, mija, they make it against the innocent first. It's easier to terrorize than to fight." But Esperanza had also taught her that terror only worked when people believed they had no choices. Elena studied the fire pattern again, this time looking not for threats, but for gaps. "There," she said, pointing to a dark space between 2 distant camps. "That ridge runs northwest for about 15 kilometers. It's too steep for vehicles, but if we're careful, we can follow it on foot to where it connects with the old mining road. From there, it's only 20 kilometers to the emergency airfield at Ghazni." "On foot?" Marcus's voice cracked. With wounded civilians and children? In this weather? Elena turned to study the convoy behind them. 27 people, including 6 children under the age of 12, 2 pregnant women, and 3 wounded fighters who'd sought refuge at their medical station. The temperature was dropping toward freezing. They had limited medical supplies, and the rocky terrain would be treacherous even in daylight. "It's the only way," she said simply. "The vehicles won't make it up that grade, and staying on roads means staying predictable. We have maybe 2 hours before those search patterns close around us completely." Dr. Okofar began mentally cataloging their medical supplies. "I have enough painkillers for the wounded, but hypothermia will be our biggest threat. How long will we be exposed?" 6 hours if we move fast and don't encounter any patrols, 8 hours if we have to take detours or hide. Either way, we'll need to reach the mining road before dawn or we'll be visible to anyone with a decent telescope. As if summoned by her words, a new set of lights appeared on the southern horizon, vehicle headlights moving in convoy formation directly toward their position. Elena's blood turned to ice water as she counted them. 12 vehicles, possibly more hidden behind the lead elements. This wasn't a patrol or a checkpoint. This was a dedicated hunting party. "Move," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "Everyone out of the vehicles now. Grab only what you can carry. Water, medicine, warm clothes. Leave everything else." The next 20 minutes passed in controlled chaos. Elena organized the evacuation with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning for this moment without realizing it. She assigned Marcus and Dr. Okofar to help the wounded, established a buddy system for the children, and distributed emergency supplies from the hidden cache she'd assembled over months of supply runs. "You've been preparing for this," Dr. Okofar observed, as Elena handed her a backpack filled with medical essentials. It wasn't a question. "Someone had to," Elena replied, helping an elderly translator named Rashid secure a warm jacket around his thin shoulders. The vehicles of wounded went through before convoy after convoy got hit because they relied entirely on technology and official routes. The Taliban have been doing this for 20 years. They know how to hunt vehicles, but they don't know how to track someone who navigates by stars. The convoy of hunters was getting closer, their headlights now visible as individual beams probing the darkness. Elena led her group away from the trucks and toward the base of the ridge, where a narrow path wound upward between massive boulders. The path wasn't marked on any map, but she'd spotted it months ago during a supply run and filed it away as potential escape route. "How did you even know this path existed?" Marcus asked, as they began climbing, his breath already coming hard in the thin air. "Because I listen," Elena replied, helping one of the pregnant women navigate around a loose rock. The local staff at the medical station told stories about smugglers and resistance fighters using mountain routes during the Soviet occupation. Most of you dismissed those stories as folklore, but I collected them. Every route description, every landmark, every warning about dangerous passages. Behind them, searchlights began sweeping the area where they had abandoned their vehicles. The hunting party had found their trail, which meant they had maybe 30 minutes before train trackers started following footprints. Elena pushed the pace, using her knowledge of stellar navigation to maintain direction even as the winding path seemed to lead them in circles. The first casualty came an hour into the climb, when Rashid stumbled on loose shale and twisted his ankle. Dr. Okofar examined the injury by flashlight, her professional calm masking deep concern. "It's a bad sprain, possibly a hairline fracture," she reported quietly to Elena. "He can walk, but not at the pace we need to maintain."
Elena studied the terrain ahead, her mind processing variables like a complex equation. The mining road was still 4 hours away at their current speed. Rashid's injury would slow them down by at least an hour, possibly 2. Behind them, she could hear the distant sound of dogs barking. The hunting party had brought tracking animals. "Leave me," Rashid said in a heavily accented English, his dignity intact despite his pain. "I am old man. You save the children." "Nobody gets left behind," Elena replied firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Dr. Okafor, what do you need to stabilize him for the rest of the journey?" As Sarah worked on Rashid's ankle, Elena studied the stars and recalculated their route. The original path would take them directly to the mining road, but it also followed the most logical trajectory, exactly what experienced trackers would anticipate. Her grandmother's voice whispered across the years. "When you're being hunted, Mija, don't go where they expect. Go where they fear to follow." "Change of plans," Elena announced to the group. "We're going higher, following the star path to the snow line. It's more dangerous, but it will put us above their search pattern." Marcus looked at her as if she'd suggested jumping off a cliff. "The snow line? People will get altitude sickness. The children won't be able to handle the cold." "The children won't handle captivity either," Elena shot back, her patience with his constant objections finally exhausted. "I've been studying weather patterns for 18 months. There's a warming trend at altitude tonight, unusual but documented. We'll have maybe 3 hours before the temperature drops to dangerous levels." Dr. Okafor finished bandaging Rashid's ankle and looked up at Elena with something approaching awe. "You've really thought of everything, haven't you?" Elena helped Rashid to his feet, supporting his weight as they prepared to resume climbing. "I've thought about survival. Every day for 18 months, I've thought about what would happen if everything went wrong at once. Tonight, it did." The dogs were getting closer, their barking now accompanied by human voices shouting commands in Pashto. Elena pushed the group harder, following a path that existed more in her memory than on the physical landscape. The stars provided direction, but navigation required constant recalculation as they moved through terrain that shifted from rocky trail to loose scree to patches of ice that reflected starlight like broken mirrors. 2 hours into the new route, they encountered their first major obstacle, a ravine about 15 meters wide with a drop of at least 30 meters to jagged rocks below. The original path would have avoided this entirely, but Elena's detour had led them directly to a crossing that looked impossible in the darkness. "We can't go around," she said, studying the ravine's edges with her flashlight. "It extends for kilometers in both directions, and we don't have time to backtrack." She pointed to a fallen tree that spanned the gap, its trunk thick enough to walk on, but slick with ice and moss. "That's our bridge." "You're insane," Marcus said flatly. "One slip and whoever falls dies. We can't ask pregnant women and children to cross that." Elena was already testing the log's stability, her movements careful but confident. "We can't ask them to face capture either. Dr. Okafor, what are the medical realities here?" Sarah looked from the makeshift bridge to the faces of our group, her training warring with her protective instincts. "Capture means execution for anyone who's worked with international aid organizations. The pregnant women, the children, they'll be used as examples." "Then we cross," Elena said simply. She removed her backpack and began rigging a safety line using climbing rope she'd salvaged from the emergency supplies. "One person at a time with the rope as backup. I'll go first to secure the other end." What followed was the longest 30 minutes of Elena's life. One by one, she guided 27 people across a bridge that shouldn't have supported a single person, using techniques her grandmother had taught her for crossing flash flood channels in the desert. The stars provided just enough light to navigate by, and her voice provided just enough confidence to keep panic at bay. Rashid crossed despite his injured ankle, crawling on hands and knees while Elena held the safety rope. The pregnant women moved with the careful deliberation of people who understood they carried more than their own lives. The children crossed as if it were an adventure. Their natural agility compensated for their lack of understanding about the consequences of failure. Marcus crossed last, his fear of heights overcome by his growing respect for Elena's leadership. When he reached the other side, he looked back at the bridge they'd just traversed and shook his head in amazement. "How did you know it would hold?" he asked. Elena was already packing the safety equipment and checking their position against the star map in her head. I didn't, but I knew it was stronger than fear, and fear was the only other option. The sound of dogs had faded during their crossing, but Elena knew the hunting party would find the ravine eventually. They'd probably assumed their quarry had gone around, buying precious time but not enough to guarantee escape. The mining road was still 2 hours away, and dawn would break in less than 4 hours. As they resumed climbing toward the snow line, Elena felt the weight of 27 lives pressing against her shoulders like her grandmother's heaviest blanket. Every decision now carried the potential for disaster. Every miscalculation could cost lives. But for the first time in 18 months, she also felt completely present in her own skin, using abilities she'd been forced to hide in service of people who'd never bothered to see her clearly. The stars wheeled overhead, constant and reliable, pointing the way toward safety if she was skilled enough to read their message correctly. Behind them, the hunting party searched the darkness for prey that had vanished into the night sky itself, guided by knowledge older than maps and stronger than any technology man had ever devised. Dawn found them 300 meters below the snowline, huddled in a natural shelter formed by wind-carved rocks that provided protection from both the elements and prying eyes. Elena had pushed them through 6 hours of the most treacherous terrain any of them had ever encountered, navigating by stars with a precision that had transformed skepticism into something approaching reverence. Now, as the first pale light touched the eastern peaks, she finally allowed herself to study the faces of the people she'd led to safety. Dr. Okafor sat with her back against a boulder, methodically checking each person for signs of hypothermia or altitude sickness. Her movements carried the automatic efficiency of someone who'd worked in crisis conditions, but Elena noticed how Sarah's eyes kept returning to her with a mixture of professional respect and personal wonder. Pulse rates are elevated but stable, Sarah reported quietly. Rashid's ankle is holding up better than expected, and the pregnant women are managing well. No signs of serious altitude sickness, though we're pushing the limits of what's safe at this elevation. Marcus crouched near the shelter's opening, studying the valley below through binoculars. His earlier skepticism had evaporated entirely during the night's journey, replaced with a grudging admiration that seemed to surprise him as much as everyone else. The hunting party's regrouping near our abandoned vehicles. Looks like they're bringing in more dogs and some kind of tracking equipment. They know we're out here somewhere. Elena nodded, already calculating distances and timing. The mining road lay 2 kilometers below them, visible now as a pale scar winding through the rocky landscape. Beyond that, the emergency airfield at Ghazni appeared as a distant smudge of concrete and metal, close enough to approach, but still dangerous to approach. We have maybe 2 hours before they expand their search pattern to include the high country, she said, accepting a cup of hot tea from one of the translators. The bitter liquid tasted like salvation and felt like liquid courage flowing through her exhausted body. "How did you know so much about their tactics?" asked Amira, one of the pregnant women. The young teacher had been quiet during most of their journey, focused on conserving energy for herself and her unborn child. Now her question carried the weight of someone who'd watched Elena's expertise unfold throughout the night. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena hesitated, recognizing this as the moment when her carefully maintained invisibility would finally shatter completely. For 18 months, she'd allowed her colleagues to see only what they expected, a competent driver who kept to herself and followed orders without question. Revealing the depth of her knowledge would mean acknowledging how thoroughly she'd been preparing for this exact scenario. "My father was a helicopter pilot in Iraq," she said finally, the words emerging slowly like water from a deep well. 2 tours, decorated for evacuating wounded soldiers under fire.
When he came home, he couldn't stop talking about tactical movement, about how insurgents used terrain and timing to their advantage. I grew up listening to those stories. Dr. Okafar lowered her medical supplies, giving Elena the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for critical patients. But that's not all, is it? The navigation, the route planning, the way you've anticipated every obstacle, that's not something you learned from war stories. Elena felt herself standing at a crossroads that had been 18 months in the making. She could continue hiding behind partial truths, or she could finally allow these people to see the woman her grandmother had raised, someone who'd been preparing for this moment since childhood, someone whose knowledge extended far beyond what anyone had bothered to ask about. "My grandmother taught me celestial navigation when I was 10 years old," she said finally. Her family had been guides for generations, people who led travelers across the desert using nothing but stars and intuition. When she came north as a young woman, she brought that knowledge with her. Marcus lowered the binoculars, his engineer's mind struggling to process information that didn't fit his understanding of how the world worked. "But that's archaic. Why would anyone still learn that stuff when we have GPS?" Elena felt her grandmother's spirit rising within her, fierce and protective and utterly unimpressed with technology that could be jammed, hacked, or broken by enemy action. Because GPS satellites can be shot down, because electronic equipment fails, because sometimes the only thing standing between you and disaster is knowledge that's been passed down through 1,000 generations of people who survived by paying attention. The admission hung in the morning air like incense, sacred and slightly dangerous. Elena had never spoken so directly about her heritage, had never allowed herself to acknowledge how completely her grandmother's teachings had shaped her approach to everything from route planning to risk assessment. "You've been studying us," Dr. Okafar said suddenly, her voice carrying not accusation, but a kind of amazed recognition. "Not just the terrain or the tactical situation. You've been studying all of us, learning our strengths and weaknesses, figuring out how to keep us alive if everything went wrong." Elena nodded, feeling simultaneously exposed and liberated. Someone had to. You're all experts in your fields, but this isn't your field. I've watched convoy after convoy get hit because they relied entirely on official procedures and modern technology. The Taliban have been fighting here for 20 years. They know how to neutralize every advantage we think we have. "Except star navigation," Marcus said slowly, understanding finally beginning to dawn in his voice. "They can jam our radios, destroy our GPS systems, hunt our vehicles, but they can't turn off the stars." "The stars don't take sides," Elena replied, echoing one of her grandmother's favorite sayings. "They shine for everyone equally, but they only guide people who know how to listen." Amira struggled to her feet, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward but her dignity intact. "You saved us," she said simply. "While we were treating you like a servant, you were preparing to save our lives. How do we apologize for something like that?" Elena felt tears threatening for the first time since their ordeal began, but they were tears of recognition rather than sadness. For 18 months, she'd carried the weight of being invisible, of having her knowledge and experience dismissed by people who saw only what they expected to see. Now, finally, she was being seen clearly, not as just the driver, but as the guardian she'd always been.
"You don't apologize," she said quietly. "You helped me get everyone home safely, because we're not safe yet." As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of rotor blades began echoing off the mountain walls. Elena grabbed the binoculars from Marcus and scanned the eastern horizon, her blood turning to ice water at what she saw there. 3 helicopters were approaching in formation, flying low and fast in a search pattern that would bring them directly over their hiding spot. "Russian-made Mi-8s," she said grimly, recognizing the aircraft's distinctive silhouette.
Transport helicopters with door gunners. They're not here to capture anyone. They're here to eliminate witnesses. Dr. Okafor began rapidly packing her medical supplies, her movements sharp with controlled panic. How long before they reach us? Elena calculated angles and timing with the precision her grandmother had taught her for tracking celestial objects across the sky. 8 minutes, maybe 10. But there's another problem. See that lead aircraft? It's carrying external fuel tanks. They're planning to establish an extended search pattern. Even if we evade this pass, they'll keep coming back. Marcus stared at the approaching helicopters with the fascination of someone watching his own death approach. There's nowhere to hide up here. The terrain's too exposed. Elena was already scanning their surroundings, her mind processing options with desperate creativity. The rock shelter that had protected them during the night would be useless against aerial surveillance. The nearest tree line was hundreds of meters away, too far to reach before the helicopters arrived. But directly below them, barely visible in the morning light, she spotted something that made her heart race with possibility. "The mining tunnels," she said, pointing to a dark opening in the cliff face about 50 meters down a treacherous slope. "The old copper mine my grandmother's stories mentioned. If we can reach it before the helicopters get here, we can wait out the search underground." "That's not a path," Marcus protested, studying the near vertical descent. "That's a controlled fall, with pregnant women and children?" Elena was already testing handholds in the rock, her movements sure despite the danger. "It's our only option. Dr. Okafor, how quickly can you organize a rope descent with our medical cases?" Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her mind calculating risks versus alternatives. 3 minutes to reg safety lines, 2 minutes per person to descend safely. We'll need at least 20 minutes total. "The helicopters will be here in 7 minutes, Elena replied, looping climbing rope around a sturdy boulder. "We do this fast or we don't do it at all." What followed was a descent that defied every safety protocol Elena had ever learned, guided by desperation and her grandmother's voice whispering instructions about trusting rock and rope and gravity. She went first, establishing anchor points and safety stops, while the sound of rotor blades grew steadily louder. Behind her, Dr. Okafor organized the medical team with military precision, while Marcus overcame his fear of heights to help lower the children. The first helicopter crested the ridge just as Rashid, moving despite his injured ankle, disappeared into the tunnel entrance. Elena pressed herself against the cliff face, feeling rotor wash buffet her body as the aircraft passed overhead. The pilot was searching methodically, thermal imaging scanning for heat signatures that would betray human presence. Inside the tunnel, 27 people huddled in darkness that smelled of copper and ancient rock. Elena counted heads by touch, confirming everyone had made the descent safely, while overhead, the helicopter circled like predatory birds. The tunnel extended deeper into the mountain than she'd hoped, with side passages that would provide additional hiding spots if necessary. "How did you know about this place?" Dr. Okafor whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of rotor blades outside. Elena touched the tunnel wall, feeling the tool marks left by miners who'd worked here decades before. "My grandmother told stories about the resistance fighters who used these mountains during the Soviet occupation. They hid supplies and wounded fighters in old mining tunnels, places the invaders couldn't easily search. The locals called them star roads because they were mapped by people who navigated underground the same way they navigated above ground, by understanding direction and distance without relying on landmarks."
"Star roads," Amira repeated softly, the phrase carrying weight in her accented English. "My grandfather used words like that. I thought they were just stories." "The best survival knowledge usually sounds like stories," Elena replied, remembering her grandmother's voice saying something similar during those long desert nights. "It's easier to pass down information through generations when it's wrapped in narrative. Makes it memorable." The helicopter sounds gradually faded as the search pattern moved to other areas, but Elena knew they couldn't emerge until she was certain the aircraft had left the region entirely. Using her watch and her knowledge of search protocols, she calculated they needed to wait at least 2 hours for the helicopters to exhaust their fuel and returned to base. As they settled in for an extended wait, Elena found herself studying the faces of her companions in the dim light filtering through the tunnel entrance. Something fundamental had shifted during their night journey and morning crisis. The invisible barriers that had defined their relationships for 18 months had dissolved, replaced by the raw honesty that came from shared survival. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said suddenly, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "Actually, I owe you about 100 apologies. I've been treating you like you were invisible, like your opinion didn't matter." Elena felt her grandmother's wisdom rising within her, not the bitter satisfaction of being proven right, but the deeper understanding that came from recognizing fear in others. "You treated me the way the world taught you to treat people like me. Brown women who don't have degrees from famous universities, who work with their hands instead of their computers. I'm not angry about that anymore." "You should be," Dr. Akoffer said fiercely. "I should be ashamed of myself. I'm a woman. I'm African. I know what it feels like to be underestimated. But I did the same thing to you that others have done to me. I saw what I expected to see, instead of looking at who you really are." Elena leaned back against the tunnel wall, feeling the mountain's weight above them like a protective blanket. "Who I really am is someone who listens, someone who prepares, someone who remembers that survival isn't about having the best equipment, it's about having the deepest knowledge." "Knowledge passed down by women," Amira added, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "My grandmother knew things too. How to predict weather by watching bird behavior, how to find water in the desert by reading plant growth patterns. When I have my daughter, I want to teach her those things." "Your daughter," Elena repeated, the words carrying new weight in the underground darkness. "She's going to grow up knowing that when everything modern failed, it was ancient wisdom that saved her life. That's a powerful origin story." As the hours passed in the tunnel, Elena found herself sharing knowledge she'd kept hidden for years. She taught Marcus how to read direction by the growth patterns of moss on tunnel walls. She showed Dr. Akoffer how her grandmother had used plant-based remedies to treat altitude sickness and hypothermia. She helped the children understand how sound moved differently underground, how to use echoes to map unseen passages. But the most profound revelation came when Rashid, the elderly translator, began speaking in his native Pashto to the other Afghan civilians in their group. Elena couldn't understand most of the words, but she recognized the tone, reverence mixed with recognition, as if he was identifying something sacred he thought was lost. "What is he saying?" Dr. Akoffer asked quietly. Amira translated, her voice thick with emotion. "He says Elena moves like his grandmother did, like someone who carries the knowledge of the ancestors. He says there are words in Pashto for what she did last night, for people who can guide others through darkness using only stars and intuition. He says such people are blessed by God, regardless of what country they come from." Elena felt tears she'd been holding back for 18 months finally begin to flow. Not tears of sadness or frustration, but tears of recognition. The profound relief that came from being truly seen, not just by her colleagues, but by people whose own ancestors had carried similar knowledge across these same mountains for thousands of years.
"Tell him," she said slowly, "that my grandmother would be honored by his words. Tell him that knowledge belongs to all people who need it, and that borders exist only in the minds of those who forget we're all trying to find our way home." When Rashid heard the translation, he nodded gravely and spoke again. This time, Amira's translation carried the weight of formal ceremony.
He says you are welcome in his family's village if you ever need shelter. He says people who navigate by stars are always welcome among his people because they understand that some kinds of knowledge are more valuable than gold or weapons. Outside, the sound of helicopters had faded completely, replaced by the natural silence of high mountain air. Elena checked her watch and calculated they could safely emerge in another hour, then continue their journey to the emergency airfield. But she found herself reluctant to leave the tunnel, not because of safety concerns, but because of what might be lost when they returned to the normal world. Here in the darkness, surrounded by people who finally saw her clearly, Elena had discovered something more valuable than navigation skills or survival knowledge. She'd found her voice, not just the practical voice that gave directions and made plans, but the deeper voice that carried her grandmother's wisdom and her own hard-earned understanding of what it meant to guide others through darkness toward light. The woman who would eventually emerge from the tunnel would be fundamentally different from the one who'd been dismissed as just the driver for 18 months. She would be someone who understood her own worth, someone who refused to make herself small for the comfort of others, someone who carried ancient knowledge into a modern world that desperately needed both the wisdom and the humility to listen. 3 hours after sunrise, Elena led her group out of the mining tunnel and down the final descent to the old mining road. The helicopters had departed, their search pattern having found nothing but empty rocks and morning shadows. But as they reached the relative safety of the valley floor, Elena realized their ordeal was far from over. The emergency airfield at Ghazni lay 20 kilometers away across open terrain, and their absence from the scheduled evacuation would have triggered military protocols that could be as dangerous as the Taliban hunting party. "Coalition forces will assume we're either dead or captured," Marcus said as they paused to rest and reorganize their supplies. His engineering background had given him insight into how military logistics worked, and his growing respect for Elena had taught him to voice concerns rather than make assumptions. Dr. O'Coffer finished checking Rashid's ankle, which had held up remarkably well during their tunnel descent. "Approaching the airfield could be more dangerous than avoiding it," she said grimly. "Trigger-happy soldiers, aerial patrols, minefields around the perimeter. We could survive the Taliban only to be killed by our own people." Elena studied the terrain ahead, her mind processing variables that had become as familiar as breathing during their night-long journey. The airfield was visible in the distance as a geometric scar on the natural landscape, surrounded by the telltale earthworks and concrete barriers that marked military installations. Between their position and safety lay 20 kilometers of rolling hills, occasional villages, and the constant possibility of encountering either insurgent forces or coalition patrols who might shoot first and identify targets later.
For the next hour, Elena organized the most ambitious project of her life. Using techniques her grandmother had taught her for creating stone markers in the desert, she directed the group in constructing a massive ground signal that would be visible from aircraft altitude. They arranged rocks in precise geometric patterns, created shadow lines that pointed to specific cardinal directions, and used reflected sunlight from salvaged mirrors to create a constellation pattern that matched the Big Dipper. "This is insane," Marcus muttered, as he helped position a boulder according to Elena's exacting specifications. "You're asking us to build a monument in hostile territory, using astronomical principles to spell out a message that might not even be understood by whoever finds it." "The message will be understood by anyone who knows how to read it," Elena replied, adjusting the angle of a mirror fragment to catch the morning sun. "Military pilots are trained in basic celestial navigation as backup for electronic systems. When they see a ground signal that perfectly replicates stellar navigation principles, they'll know it was created by someone with professional knowledge. Dr. Okafor stepped back to survey their work, her medical training giving her an appreciation for precision and systematic thinking. But how will they know we're friendly forces instead of an elaborate trap? Elena pointed to the central element of their signal, a carefully arranged circle of stones that created a natural compass rose, with additional markers indicating magnetic declination and true north. Because only Allied forces would know the specific magnetic declination for this region, it's classified information, updated monthly in navigation briefings. The Taliban might be able to fake a lot of things, but they can't fake knowledge they don't possess. As they worked, Elena found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories of resistance fighters during the Mexican Revolution, who'd used similar techniques to communicate with allies across vast distances. The methods were ancient, but the principles remained constant, using landscape and celestial knowledge to create messages that could be read by those who shared the same educational background while remaining invisible to enemies who lacked that specific training. When the signal was complete, Elena led the group to a concealed observation point where they could watch for aircraft while remaining hidden from ground-based searchers. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult part of their entire ordeal. After hours of constant movement and immediate danger, the enforced stillness felt like emotional torture. "Tell me about your grandmother," Dr. Okafor said quietly, as they watched the eastern sky for signs of aircraft. "How did she learn navigation in an era when women weren't supposed to have that kind of knowledge?" Elena settled back against a sun-warmed boulder, feeling her grandmother's presence as strongly as she had during those childhood nights in the New Mexico desert. She learned it because her family's survival depended on it. Her grandfather was a guide who led people across the border during the Revolution when the regular routes were too dangerous. He taught his daughters the same skills he taught his sons, because he said knowledge was the only inheritance that couldn't be stolen by soldiers or governments. "And she passed it to you," Amira said softly. "Even though the world had changed, even though we had GPS and satellites and all the modern tools. She said the world hadn't changed as much as people thought. She said that as long as humans needed to find their way from one place to another, as long as they could get lost or separated or have their technology fail, the old knowledge would always be valuable. She just never imagined it would be valuable in a place like this." Marcus looked up from the binoculars he'd been using to scan the horizon. But it wasn't just navigation, was it? It was leadership, knowing how to read people, how to organize them, how to make decisions under pressure. That's not something your grandmother could have taught you directly. Elena considered this, recognizing truth in his observation. "She taught me to pay attention, to watch, to listen, to notice things other people overlooked. She said that people who learn to navigate by stars develop a different way of seeing. They notice patterns, they think about systems, they understand that everything is connected to everything else. Those skills transfer to more than just finding direction." The sound of aircraft engines interrupted their conversation, growing steadily louder as a military transport approached from the southeast. Elena grabbed the binoculars and studied the approaching plane, her heart racing as she recognized the distinctive silhouette of a C-130 Hercules, a coalition aircraft capable of landing on the emergency airfield. "Perfect timing," she murmured, watching the aircraft's flight path. "They're coming in for a landing approach, which means they'll pass directly over our signal at the optimal viewing angle." As the C-130 approached their position, Elena used a mirror fragment to flash reflected sunlight at the aircraft in the international distress pattern her father had taught her. 3 short flashes, 3 long flashes, 3 short flashes, repeated until the pilot acknowledged. The response came almost immediately. The aircraft waggled its wings, indicating the crew had seen and understood their signal. 20 minutes later, the sound of helicopter rotors announced the arrival of a military rescue team. Elena led her group to the predetermined pickup zone they'd indicated in their ground signal, watching as a UH-60 Blackhawk settled into a perfect landing despite the challenging terrain. The rescue team that emerged from the helicopter was led by Captain Jennifer Walsh, a flight surgeon whose competence was immediately apparent in the way she organized medical triage for the group. But Elena noticed how Captain Walsh's eyes kept returning to the elaborate ground signal they'd constructed, studying it with the appreciation of someone who understood its complexity. "That's some of the most sophisticated field navigation I've ever seen," Captain Walsh said as her medics checked the refugees for injuries and exhaustion. "Whoever designed that signal has serious training in celestial navigation and military communications protocols." "That would be Elena," Dr. Okafor said proudly, gesturing toward the woman who'd guided them through 8 hours of impossible terrain using nothing but stars and intuition. "She saved all of us, led us through enemy territory, evaded search helicopters, and got us to safety using knowledge I didn't even know still existed." Captain Walsh studied Elena with new interest, taking in the confident posture and calm competence of someone who'd been tested by extreme circumstances and proven herself equal to the challenge. "You're Elena Vasquez, listed as a transportation coordinator for the medical mission, but your personnel file doesn't mention any formal navigation training." Elena felt herself standing at another crossroads, another moment when she could choose invisibility or acknowledgement. But 18 months of being overlooked, followed by 8 hours of proving her worth when it mattered most, had fundamentally changed how she saw herself and her place in the world. "My training came from my grandmother. She taught me celestial navigation when I was 10 years old, along with other skills that don't appear on official transcripts. Last night, those skills kept 27 people alive when all the modern technology failed." Captain Walsh nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. "I've seen your supply run reports. Always on time, never any major incidents, consistently high marks for safety and efficiency. But you were doing more than just driving, weren't you? You were studying, learning, preparing for exactly this kind of situation." "Someone had to," Elena replied, echoing the phrase that had become her mantra during months of being dismissed and overlooked. "I knew that eventually there would be a situation where being just the driver wouldn't be enough. I wanted to be ready." As the medical team finished their evaluations and prepared to evacuate the group to safety, Elena found herself surrounded by people who were seeing her clearly for the first time. Dr. Okafor spoke passionately to Captain Walsh about Elena's leadership during their ordeal. Marcus documented the navigation techniques she'd used, already planning to recommend her for formal recognition. The Afghan civilians spoke among themselves in reverent tones, using words that Amira translated as expressions of profound respect and gratitude. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Rashid approached Elena with the careful dignity of someone making a formal presentation. Speaking through Amira's translation, he offered Elena a small carved stone that had belonged to his own grandfather, a traditional Afghan compass rose used by mountain guides for centuries. He says this belonged to his grandfather, who guided caravans through these mountains before there were roads or maps, Amira translated, tears streaming down her face. He says it should belong to someone who understands that the best navigation comes from the heart and the stars, not from machines that can be broken by enemies. Elena accepted the stone compass with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of history and tradition in the carved surface. "Tell him that I'm honored beyond words. Tell him that his grandfather and my grandmother probably would have understood each other perfectly, even if they never met." As the helicopter lifted off toward the safety of coalition territory, Elena looked down at the ground signal they'd constructed, 27 people's worth of desperate creativity organized around knowledge that stretched back thousands of years. The signal would probably be dismantled by the next patrol that found it, but the knowledge that had created it would live on, passed from one generation to the next like a flame that could never be completely extinguished. 6 months later, Elena received a letter from the Department of Defense offering her a position as a navigation instructor at the Army's Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape School. The letter specifically mentioned her innovative application of traditional navigation techniques in modern tactical environments, and noted that her methods had been incorporated into new training protocols for Special Operations Forces. But more importantly, she received regular letters from the people she'd guided to safety. Dr. Okafor had returned to Nigeria, where she was training rural medical workers in basic navigation and wilderness survival. Marcus had left engineering to become a teacher, incorporating traditional knowledge systems into modern STEM education. Amira had given birth to a healthy daughter, whom she'd named Esperanza in honor of Elena's grandmother. And every clear night, Elena would climb to the highest point she could find and spend time with the stars that had guided her through the darkness. Not just the physical darkness of that terrifying night in Afghanistan, but the deeper darkness of being invisible, dismissed, and underestimated. The stars had always been there, waiting patiently for someone who knew how to listen to their ancient wisdom. 5 years later, Elena stood before a classroom of 30 military officers at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, using a laser pointer to trace constellation patterns on a digital star map projected against the classroom wall. But unlike the sterile presentations that had dominated her own education, this lesson crackled with the electricity of lived experience, every technical detail anchored by stories of survival and recognition hard-won in the mountains of Afghanistan. Navigation technology will fail, she told her students, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned these lessons when failure meant death. GPS satellites can be jammed or destroyed. Electronic equipment breaks down in extreme weather. Batteries die at the worst possible moments. But the stars have been reliable for thousands of years, and they'll be reliable long after our current technology is obsolete. Captain Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus, but possessing the same engineer's precision that had made him initially skeptical of Elena's methods, raised her hand. Instructor Vasquez, how do we convince our units to learn celestial navigation when they're already overloaded with high-tech systems to master? Elena smiled, remembering her own struggles to be heard and valued by people who trusted technology more than wisdom. You teach them that redundancy isn't just about carrying backup equipment. It's about carrying backup knowledge. The soldier who can navigate by stars when the GPS fails is the soldier who brings everyone home. After class, Elena walked across the base to her other job, the one that paid less but meant more. 3 afternoons a week, she taught navigation to civilian groups, Girl Scout troops, hiking clubs, immigrant families who wanted their children to understand that knowledge could be more valuable than any material possession. These classes were smaller, more personal, infused with the same spirit her grandmother had brought to those long desert nights in New Mexico. Today's class included 12-year-old Maya Patel, whose parents had emigrated from India and wanted their daughter to learn skills that connected traditional knowledge with modern applications. Maya reminded her of herself at that age, curious, observant, slightly apart from her peers, but deeply engaged with the world around her. "Mrs. Vasquez," Maya asked as we practiced finding Polaris using the Big Dipper as a guide, "how did your grandmother learn all this stuff? Did she go to school for it?" Elena knelt beside Maya, adjusting the girl's angle of observation toward the North Star. Her school was the desert itself. Her teachers were her grandfather and great-aunt, who learned from their grandparents, who learned from theirs. Knowledge passed down through generations of people who understood that survival sometimes depends on remembering things the world has forgotten. "Like what happened to you in Afghanistan," Maya said matter-of-factly, "when the computer stopped working and only the stars could help." Elena nodded, still amazed by how clearly children grasped concepts that adults often struggled to accept. Exactly like that. The old knowledge saved modern lives because someone had bothered to keep it alive.
As the class ended and parents arrived to collect their children, Elena felt her phone vibrate with a text message from Dr. Sarah Okafor, now directing a rural medical program in northern Nigeria. The message included a photo of Sarah teaching village health workers to navigate using star patterns, ensuring they could reach remote patients even when roads were impassable and GPS signals were unavailable. Teaching your grandmother's methods to people whose grandmothers probably knew similar techniques, Sarah's message read. Amazing how knowledge comes full circle when we stop being too proud to listen. Elena replied with a photo of her own evening class and walked to her truck. The same reliable vehicle that had carried her through 5 years of teaching, speaking engagements, and consulting work with military and civilian organizations worldwide. But tonight, she had a different destination in mind. The drive to the New Mexico desert took 6 hours, time Elena used to process the day's lessons and prepare for the conversation she'd been planning for months. Her grandmother's adobe house had been empty since Esperanza's death 3 years earlier, but Elena had maintained it as a retreat and memorial, a place where the old knowledge felt most present and powerful. She arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of those childhood evenings when her world had been transformed by an elderly woman's patient teaching. Elena spread a blanket on the same patch of ground where her grandmother had shared the secrets of celestial navigation and settled in to wait for full darkness. The stars emerged slowly, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as the last traces of daylight faded from the western horizon. Elena identified each constellation as it appeared, speaking their names aloud in both English and the mixture of Spanish and indigenous words her grandmother had used. Polaris, as always, appeared exactly where it should be, constant and reliable in a universe that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. "I kept my promise, abuela," Elena said softly, her words carried away by the desert wind. "I remembered everything you taught me. I used it when it mattered most, and now I'm teaching others, just like you taught me." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through dozens of messages from former students, colleagues, and the people she'd guided to safety 5 years ago. Marcus had become a high school teacher in Oregon, incorporating traditional navigation into his physics classes. Amira's daughter Esperanza was now 5 years old and learning to find the Big Dipper from her bedroom window in Germany, where her mother worked as a translator for refugee resettlement programs. But perhaps the most meaningful message had come from Rashid, the elderly translator who'd crossed that impossible ravine on an injured ankle rather than be left behind. His grandson, now studying at Kabul University, had written to Elena in careful English, "My grandfather says you are proof that knowledge has no borders, that wisdom belongs to all people who need it. He wants you to know that your name is spoken with respect in our village, and your story is told to children who will carry it to their children."
A shooting star streaked across the northern sky, burning bright and brief against the eternal patterns of the constellations. Elena made the same wish she'd been making since childhood, that she would always be worthy of the knowledge she'd been given, and that she would use it to help others find their way home. 10 years later, the invitation arrived on official Department of Defense letterhead, but the words were personal enough to bring tears to Elena's eyes. The Army was establishing a new training facility for unconventional navigation techniques, and they wanted to name it the Elena Vasquez Center for Traditional Knowledge Integration, honoring not just Elena's grandmother, but the thousands of indigenous teachers whose wisdom had been preserved against all odds.
But the real measure of her legacy wasn't found in newspaper articles or military commendations. It lived in the thousands of people around the world who could find their way home using nothing but stars and intuition, in the children who learned that their grandparents' knowledge was as valuable as any computer program, in the understanding that survival sometimes required remembering what the modern world had chosen to forget. At the memorial service held under the desert sky she'd loved so much, speakers included military officers and Nobel Prize winners, refugee advocates, and university professors.
indigenous knowledge keepers and technology executives who had learned to value wisdom alongside innovation. They spoke of Elena's technical expertise and her teaching gifts, her courage under fire, and her patient mentorship of thousands of students. But the most moving tribute came from Esperanza Varga, the daughter Amira had named in honor of Elena's grandmother, now a young woman working as an astronomer and indigenous rights advocate. Speaking in the clear, confident voice of someone who had been raised to believe her knowledge mattered, Esperanza read from a letter Elena had written to her years earlier. "My dear friend, when you read this, I will have joined my grandmother among the stars she taught me to follow. But do not mourn for me. Celebrate instead the knowledge that continues to flow like a river from one generation to the next, carrying with it the wisdom of countless ancestors who understood that some truths are too precious to lose." Esperanza Varga's voice carried across the desert gathering with the same quiet confidence Elena had possessed, the same certainty that came from understanding one's place in an infinite universe. As she read Elena's final letter, stars began appearing in the darkening sky above. First, Venus, then the brightest stars of summer, finally the full tapestry of constellations that had guided Elena through her most challenging moments. "I have spent my life learning that recognition is not something we can demand or expect. It is something we earn through service, through competence, through the patient accumulation of wisdom that others cannot ignore when survival depends upon it. But more importantly, I have learned that the greatest navigation challenge is not finding our way through physical terrain. It is finding our way to our own authentic voice, our own unshakable confidence in the value of what we know." The memorial service had drawn people from 6 continents, all of them connected by Elena's teaching and example. Dr. Sarah Okafar, now in her 70s but still directing medical programs across Africa, sat beside Marcus Chen's daughter, who had become a physics professor specializing in the intersection of traditional knowledge and modern science. Scattered throughout the gathering were former military students, wilderness guides, refugee advocates, and indigenous teachers, a living constellation of people whose lives had been changed by one woman's refusal to remain invisible. "When I was young, my grandmother told me that stars were the first teachers, the original classroom where humans learned to find their way across impossible distances. She said that anyone who truly understood star navigation would never be lost because they would carry the entire universe within their memory. I have tried to honor that teaching by ensuring it never dies with me." Maya Patel, now director of the Elena Vasquez Institute for Traditional Navigation at Stanford University, stood to address the gathering. At 42, she embodied everything Elena had hoped for: a brilliant scientist who honored ancient wisdom, a teacher who could bridge cultures and generations, a leader who understood that knowledge belonged to anyone willing to learn. "Elena saved my life twice," Maya said, her voice clear in the desert stillness. "Once when I was 12 and lost on a hiking trip when she taught me to use Polaris to find my way back to Cab, and again when I was 25 and lost in my career, when she showed me that traditional knowledge wasn't the opposite of modern science, it was the foundation that made real science possible." Maya gestured to the star-filled sky above them. "She taught us that navigation isn't just about finding direction. It's about understanding patterns, recognizing connections, and trusting knowledge that has been tested across generations. Those same skills that helped her guide 27 people to safety in Afghanistan have been used by her students to solve problems in medicine, engineering, environmental science, and dozens of other fields." The crowd included 3 generations of the families Elena had saved during that terrifying night in Afghanistan. Amira's daughter Esperanza had brought her own children, twins named Marcus and Sarah, in honor of the colleagues who had learned to see Elena clearly when it mattered most. The children, now 8 years old, could identify major constellations and understood the basics of celestial navigation, carrying forward knowledge that stretched back thousands of years.
I want you to know that every clear night, I have climbed to the highest point I could find and spent time with the stars that guided me through darkness. Not just the physical darkness of that night in Afghanistan, but the deeper darkness of being invisible, dismissed, and underestimated. The stars were always there, waiting patiently for someone who knew how to listen to their ancient wisdom. As Esperanza continued reading Elena's letter, a remarkable thing began happening throughout the gathering. People started pointing out constellations to each other, sharing fragments of star knowledge they had learned from Elena over the years. Children showed their grandparents how to find the Big Dipper. Military officers taught civilians about navigation techniques. Indigenous elders recognized constellation patterns their own grandparents had taught them, creating connections across cultures and continents. Dr. James Whitefeather, a Lakota astronomer who had worked with Elena to document traditional star knowledge from dozens of Native American tribes, stood to share a memory. Elena understood something that many academics miss, that knowledge doesn't belong to any one people or culture. It belongs to humanity. She collected navigation techniques from around the world not to claim them as her own, but to ensure they would survive for the people who might need them. He gestured to a group of young people who had traveled from the Pine Ridge Reservation. These students are learning star navigation as part of their cultural heritage, but they're also learning Elena's techniques from Afghanistan, from the Sonoran Desert, from the mountains of Nepal. She showed them that honoring their ancestors meant being open to wisdom from all ancestors. The most profound lesson I can leave you is this: your knowledge matters. Whatever wisdom you carry, whether it comes from grandparents or textbooks, from the desert or the laboratory, from ancient traditions or modern discoveries, it has value that the world needs. Do not let anyone convince you to make yourself small. Do not apologize for what you know. And when the moment comes that your knowledge can save lives or solve problems or bridge divides, step forward with confidence. The letter's words seemed to crystallize something that had been building throughout Elena's life and career. Around the memorial gathering, people began sharing their own stories of hidden knowledge, of expertise that had been dismissed until crisis made it essential. A refugee from Somalia described using traditional weather prediction to save her village from flooding. A former gang member from Los Angeles explained how his grandmother's plant knowledge had led to his career in pharmaceutical research. A military veteran talked about indigenous tracking techniques that had kept his unit alive in Iraq. Captain Jennifer Walsh, now a general and director of the Army's Unconventional Warfare Center, stepped forward to make an announcement that surprised even Elena's closest colleagues. The Department of Defense is establishing the Elena Vasquez Fellowship Program, providing full funding for students who want to study traditional knowledge systems and their applications to modern challenges. But more than that, we're requiring all special operations personnel to complete basic training in celestial navigation and indigenous survival techniques. She paused, looking up at the stars that had guided Elena through her most challenging moments. Elena proved that the military's greatest strength isn't our technology. It's our people and the knowledge they carry. We're going to make sure that lesson isn't forgotten.
I have watched with joy as my students have taken the knowledge I shared and carried it into places I never imagined. Maya has established university programs that honor traditional wisdom alongside cutting-edge research. Marcus has trained thousands of teachers to incorporate indigenous knowledge into STEM education. Sarah has created medical programs that combine modern medicine with traditional healing practices from around the world. The memorial continued with the most beautiful tribute Elena could have imagined, a practical demonstration of everything she had taught. As midnight approached, hundreds of people spread across the desert, using only star navigation to find their way to predetermined gathering points. Children as young as 8 successfully navigated using Polaris and the Big Dipper.
Elderly veterans moved confidently through terrain they'd never seen before, guided by constellation patterns Elena had taught them decades earlier. At the center of it all, Maya led a group of Elena's most accomplished students in creating a massive ground signal, not unlike the one Elena had constructed in Afghanistan to save 27 lives. Using techniques from a dozen different cultures, they arranged stones and mirrors to create a star map visible from aircraft altitude, a permanent monument to the knowledge Elena had preserved and shared.
The woman they had once called just the driver had become something more powerful than any individual leader or expert. She had become a catalyst for recognizing and preserving the wisdom that exists in every culture, every family, every person who has learned to pay attention to the world around them. 5 years after Elena's death, the Elena Vasquez Institute had established programs on every continent, teaching navigation skills that ranged from traditional star knowledge to modern GPS technology. But more importantly, it had created a network of people who understood that survival, both individual and collective, often depends on remembering what the modern world has chosen to forget. Children in refugee camps learned to navigate using stars their grandparents had followed across borders. Soldiers in remote outposts studied traditional weather prediction alongside satellite imagery. Urban teenagers discovered they could find their way through any city by understanding how natural and human patterns intersected. And on clear nights around the world, people looked up at the same stars that had guided Elena through her darkest moments and understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, an unbroken chain of knowledge and wisdom that connected past, present, and future, that bridged cultures and continents, that proved beyond doubt that some kinds of truth were too valuable to lose. Elena's story had become more than inspiration. It had become instruction. Every person who learned to navigate by stars, who valued their grandmother's wisdom alongside their university education, who refused to remain invisible when their knowledge could help others, they were all continuing the journey Elena had begun. The stars, as always, remained constant and reliable, shining for anyone wise enough to learn their language, patient enough to listen to their ancient songs, and brave enough to trust that the old knowledge would always be there when the new knowledge failed. In the end, Elena Vasquez had navigated more than terrain. She had navigated from invisibility to recognition, from dismissal to respect, from isolation to community. And in doing so, she had shown countless others that the path from just the driver to recognized expert, from overlooked to essential, from forgotten to remembered, was always there, written in starlight, waiting for those who knew how to read it. The woman who had saved 27 lives using ancient wisdom had gone on to save thousands more by teaching them to value the knowledge they already possessed, to trust the wisdom passed down through generations, and to understand that recognition and respect were not gifts to be granted by others, but truths to be claimed by anyone brave enough to step forward when their moment came. Under the eternal stars, Elena's legacy continued to shine, not as a monument to one remarkable woman, but as a reminder that extraordinary knowledge often lives in ordinary people, waiting for the moment when the world finally learns to see clearly what has always been there.